Hello and welcome to this workshop webinar on understanding autism and neuroaffirmative approach. This workshop is specifically designed for parents of 6 to 12-year-olds and it is brought to you by the HSC Psychology Service across Carlow and Kilkenny. We would recommend that you take a break when you're viewing this workshop, and each of the new sections within the workshop are marked with a blue slide, and this might be a good place to pause the workshop as you're viewing it if you'd like to take a break. So just to go through an outline of what we're going to cover in today's webinar, we're going to talk about some myths about autism, some facts about autism, the power of parents, how you can support your child, accessing information and support, further resources, and some final thoughts before finishing. You'll notice the multicoloured infinity symbol here on the bottom right hand corner, and just to point out that this is the preferred symbol of the autistic community, and what this represents is the diversity of autism as well as the greater neurodiversity movement. Some of you may have seen the puzzle piece symbol that's used to represent the autism in some places. But just to note that for autistic people, the puzzle piece can represent a very negative view of autism. For them, they feel that this represents autistic people as being puzzling or a mystery, whereas autistic people don't wish to be viewed as a puzzle that can't be solved or worked out. So this infinity symbol with the rainbow colours is the preferred symbol of the autistic community. Just to acknowledge at the outset that the process of receiving a diagnosis of autism for your child can be a very emotional issue as a parent, and the process of undertaking the assessment and learning about the conclusions of the assessment can be a full process of coming to terms with everything that you're learning about your child and what their diagnosis means, and how to move forward positively with this new framework. So it's just to acknowledge that there can be a lot of emotions around this, and there's no right or wrong way to feel in relation to what might be happening for your child or what their diagnosis is. To start this webinar then with a note about some language and some terms that you'll see throughout and hear about throughout the webinar. Just to explain what the difference is between person-first language and identity-first language. So within the autistic community, there can be lots of different ways of referring to autistic individuals. So you will hear some people say things like a child with autism, or versus an autistic child. So person-first language would be, an example of that would be a child saying a child with autism, whereas identity-first language would be saying an autistic child. And research has shown that the autistic community themselves prefer the terminology for it to be said as an autistic child rather than a child with autism or an adult with autism or a person with autism. And the reasoning behind that is that for autistic people, they would say that, you wouldn't say I am a person with children, you would say I'm a parent. So for an autistic person, being autistic is part of their identity and part of who they are. It's not something that's separate to them. So this is the reasoning behind the identity-first language being preferable. So while the research is saying that this is the preference of most people within the autistic community, there are some people who are autistic who prefer to refer to themselves as a person with autism, and always we would respect the personal preference of the individual. So it's quite acceptable for some people to prefer the terminology of saying that I'm a person with autism. However, it's important to know that for the vast majority of autistic people, they prefer the terminology of being referred to as an autistic person or an autistic child or an autistic adult rather than a person with autism. So there's a reference at the bottom of the slide here. If you want to read or learn about more about this, you can take a look at the article that's referenced there in the slide. So we're going to start with some myths about autism. These are some common ideas around autism that are absolute myths. So just to list a few of these, and I'm going to show a video clip that it talks about them in more detail in a moment. But these all are very much myths about autism. So I'll just go through them briefly. So the first one is that everyone is a bit autistic. That's not true. That's obviously a myth. Autism is a mental health condition. Again, autism is not a mental health condition, and it's not a learning disability. And we'll explain in a moment what autism actually is, but it's not a mental health condition. Another myth is that autism mainly affects young children. That's also not true. It's a lifelong condition. Autism people don't feel empathy. That's very untrue. Autism people can feel lots of empathy, and sometimes overly so. And we know this from our work with autistic adults and listening to autistic adults. All autistic people have a learning disability. Again, this is not true. All autistic people have special skills like Rain Man or savants. Again, this is not true. Although some people do, this is not true that everybody does. You can tell someone is autistic by looking at them. Again, this is absolutely untrue. For many people, it's not possible to tell just by looking at them, by their behaviour, that they are autistic. Autistic people like to be on their own, or they're antisocial. Again, this is not true. It's true that autistic people might interact differently, but very many autistic people like being with other people and want to be with other people and want to interact. They just do that in a different way. Autistic people always have other conditions. Again, this isn't always true. Some people do, but very many people don't. And then finally, autism can be cured. Again, this is not true. So we're going to show now a video clip that talks about all of these myths in a little bit more detail. The sound quality on this video may not be as we would like it to be. If you're having difficulty hearing the sound, you can pause this webinar at this point, and if you have access to an internet browser, if you want to search on YouTube for Autism Myths full film, you'll find this video. The picture there on the screen is a slide of what the opening frame looks like, so this is, you'll know that you're on the right one if this is what you're looking for. So we'll show this clip now, and if the sound quality isn't good for you, please do pause the video and search for the clip and watch it at this point.
There's a myth that everyone is a little bit autistic, but that's just not true. Everybody has autistic traits and everybody presents autistically at different times to a certain extent, but you're only autistic if your brain is built in that way.
Autism isn't a mental health condition. Autism actually is a cognitive difference between you and I. It's not something that should be viewed as flawed or problematic or wrong, something that needs treated. It's just how I view the world and how you view the world, and that's okay.
I would say in some ways that as an adult, being autistic in a neurotypical world, excuse the words, is actually more difficult than it was when I was a child. And obviously I've been autistic all my life. I spent the first 2 years after my diagnosis looking back and working out all the things that were probably due to me being autistic.
Autistic people don't feel empathy? Not true. Autistic people feel empathy just the same as everyone else does. Many autistic people report that they actually are often overwhelmed by other people's emotional states because they feel so strongly. But we may not always demonstrate our empathy in the way that you might expect.
This is a total myth. Many of us autistic people have learning differences. Some of us might require a little bit extra support But what we do need most of all is just your patience and your understanding.
All autistic people have special skills like Rain Man. This isn't true either. A small percentage of autistic people are savants, which means they have mathematical skills beyond compare or can produce incredible artwork. However, most are regular folk.
There is a myth that you can tell if someone is autistic just by looking at them. Well, that's not true. There are autistic people in all walks of life, in different professions, of different ages, genders, ethnicities and religions. Autism does not have a look, nor does it always have visible identifying characteristics, and when it does, they do not apply to all autistic people.
Autistic people can find socialising more tiring than non-autistic people, particularly if we have to hide our autism in order to blend in. However, we are not being antisocial. We are actively making an effort to socialise.
So, autistic people always have other conditions. Well, honestly, this is a bit complicated because quite a lot of us do. There's a lot of us with ADHD, for example, and there's an awful lot of us that have got mental health conditions. But something that's really important to remember, they are separate.
Autism can be cured. No, it can't. That's not true. It's not an illness. You can't cure or grow out of autism. It's part of brain difference. We are the beautiful people we were born to be. Value us for who we are. Don't try to cure us. Let's work together to make the world a more understanding and caring place.
So in this next section, we're going to talk about some facts about autism. So fact number 1 is that autism is a neurotype. So autism is a neurotype and it is a form of neurodiversity. So there was a past assumption that there was one particular type of brain, so the so-called normal type of brain, and anything that was different to this was viewed as deficient or abnormal. However, more recently, our understanding has grown and has improved, if you like. So just like in nature where you have biodiversity, so biodiversity refers to the biological variety and variability of life on Earth, so different types of plants or animals or microorganisms. So just like we have that within nature, in humans we have neurodiversity. And what this means is that there are different types of brains. So there's variation in the human brain, which might refer to differences in our sociability, our learning, our attention, our mood, and other functions as well. So autism is considered a neurotype within neurodiversity. So just like somebody who has a brain that aligns with ADHD or dyslexia or dyspraxia, these are all different neurotypes and autism is one of these neurotypes. So this is a nice quote from a guy called Harvey Bloom, who's a journalist, and in 1998 he said that neurodiversity may be every bit as crucial for the human race as biodiversity is for life in general. Who can say what form of wiring will prove best at any given moment? Cybernetics and computer culture, for example, may favour a somewhat autistic cast of mind. So what he's basically saying is that we need all of these different types of brains because all of these different types of brains bring different ways of thinking, different ways of experiencing, and there's power within that, there's value within that. So this poster on the right hand side of this slide is a lovely poster to help explain this, and this is a lovely tool to use if you're trying to explain this idea of neurodiversity to your child or to other people as well. So it starts by explaining how diversity is beautiful. There's diversity in the animal world, many millions of different kinds of animals, more than we can count, obviously. And then we've got diversity within people. And this is really relating to how people come in great variety of shapes, sizes, genders, abilities, and appearances. We're all unique. So bringing that one step further then, you're talking about this diversity within human brains. So no two brains are alike, and we have different names for different types like ADHD, autistic, dyslexic, typical brains, all of the different types. Fact number 2 is around the current estimates for autism. So most recent research would suggest that approximately 1 in every 65 people is autistic. This is possibly an underestimate given the large number of people that we think are undiagnosed, but this is what the most recent research will say. So autistic people are unique and varied. They're in many professions, they're across ethnicities, across different cultures, and it's really important that we recognise that autism is all around us. We mightn't always be aware or know that it's there, but it definitely is all around us. There's a traditional view, I suppose a view held a long time ago, that of autism being of one particular type. But if we think about the 1 in 65 statistic, we know that autistic people are in all areas of society. There's huge numbers of autistic doctors, teachers, journalists, lecturers, engineers, parents, students. They're in all walks of life. Fact number 3 is that autism is not a line. So it's more like a constellation of strengths and challenges. However, lots of people think that the autistic spectrum looks like this figure on the left, that you might be less autistic or more autistic, and it's a linear idea. But actually, it's more what it looks like here on the right, where you have all of these different areas, and some autistic people will have more challenges in some of these areas, and another autistic person might have less challenges in some of these areas and greater challenges in other areas. So it can be a very mixed profile. So no two autistic people are exactly alike, and this is a quote from an autistic person talking about their experience, and they're saying that they feel that they shouldn't be reduced to either high functioning or low functioning stereotypes either. So this is a nice visual representation of what this person feels their autism looks like, and the colours represent how much challenge they might have in each of the areas. Whereas this person's brother may look like this, and yet both are autistic. So another way of thinking about it is that the top graphic there would say, you know, the autistic spectrum doesn't look like this. It's not shades of, you know, having mild autism up to severe autism. It's far more like the bottom one, where there are mild issues in some area and more strong issues in others, and that varies from person to person. Fact number 4, your child has huge potential for growth and for progress. So we know this from our learning from autistic adults, that autistic people have huge potential. And society really benefits from having autistic people in the workplace, as different types of neurology bring different ways of thinking. Autistic people, as I said earlier, are in all industries. They work in management, in medicine, in academia, in law, in engineering, journalism, IT. They work in all areas. So just to go through some of the positives, and it's not to deny that there are challenges with autism. There are, and we'll come to those in a moment, but to focus from the start on some of the positives in terms of understanding autism. This is a graphic from a person called Harriet Cannon, who's with the Disability Services in the University of Leeds. And this is a lovely image to focus on. And this talks about understanding, embracing and celebrating different ways of thinking and doing can release the true power of the autistic mind. So some of the positive features of autism, autistic people are very well able to give their attention to detail. They can be very thorough, very accurate. They quite often have a strong ability to have a deep focus on something, excellent concentration, freedom from distractions for things that interest them. Their observational skills are often really good, very good at fact finding, very good at listening and learning for things that they're interested in as well. Lots of autistic people can absorb and retain facts very well. Their visual skills are often very great sources of strength for them. Often autistic people have great levels of expertise in particular areas. Their approach can be very methodical, very analytical, very good at spotting patterns and repetition. Their approach can also be very novel, so a very unique way of thinking about things and innovative in their solutions. Autistic people are often very creative and have distinctive imagination skills and great ability to express their ideas. Autistic people are also show great tenacity, strong resilience, great determination. They're often very accepting of difference, less likely to be judging of others. And autistic people often show great integrity, wonderful honesty, great loyalty, and a commitment to others and to what they know. So fact number 5 then is talking about just the areas associated with autism. So what are the features? What are the things that you might notice? So this can be broken down into a number of different areas. So social communication, sensory processing, attention allocation, and stimming behaviours. Just to note here that autism can be so very varied amongst different people, so it can be difficult to understand autism in that sense because no two autistic people are alike. So starting with social communication, so you might notice lots of differences in how your child communicates and interacts with others. So an autistic child might prefer not to look at others while they are talking. They might understand language in a literal way. So an example of that might be if you said it's raining cats and dogs, they might take that very literally. They may find it difficult to interpret facial expressions or body language, and they might find it very hard to read other people, so to pick up on social cues. They may not see the point in or value small talk, so that's social chat. They quite often place a very high value on honesty, being direct. They might be very happy and content engaging in their own preferred activities, and they might be very happy and content not to interact with others or to interact only a little with others and in certain conditions. Your child might find it hard to understand the unwritten social rules or expectations within society, and these rules can make the world seem very unpredictable and very confusing. Your child might prefer to follow particular rules or routines to help make the world seem more predictable and less scary. They might be very anxious about situations where there are certain social expectations, and they might respond to others in a different way. Your child might have very good language skills, or they might not use language at all to communicate. Your child might take language very literally, might find abstract or vague concepts or sarcasm or humour very difficult to understand. They might need extra time to process information or to answer questions. And they might communicate using echolalia if they use verbal communication. So echolalia is where somebody might repeat what others have said or phrases that they might have learned from TV or movies or things like that. Your child might need time alone if they're overwhelmed by being around others. And they might form friendships and relationships with others in different ways. So they might only want to meet up maybe once every few months outside of school, as opposed to every week. They might play alongside another child doing the same activity as them, as opposed to engaging with them on the same activity. So in thinking about social communication and thinking about your child, it's really important to think about and spend some time reflecting on what you feel your child's communication and interaction preferences might be. So within this, thinking about, does your child prefer to communicate in verbal ways or in visual ways? Do they like spoken communication, or is written or pictures a preferred method for them? Do they like songs or music as a way of communicating? Do they use gestures? Will they take you by the hand? Do they use echolalia? Would they prefer to communicate with just one person at a time? Or is it okay for there to be 2 to 3 people that they need to communicate with at a time? So spending some time just really thinking about what their preferences are. And when you're trying to communicate with your child, following their lead and imitating what they do can be a way of engaging with them and can be more meaningful for them and an easier way of communicating, rather than trying to expect your child to communicate in the way that society might expect them to do so. So there might be great significant differences in how language is used. And I suppose to note that autistic communication is just as valid as neurotypical communication and non-autistic communication. There is a lot of research at the moment as well that's showing that autistic people often communicate and interact really well with each other, but they find the neurotypical rules of communication difficult to follow. So autistic people, what we were talking about earlier, where they might be very honest or very direct in their communication or take things very literally. When autistic children are communicating with neurotypical people, those expectations can be there for them to not be so direct or not be so literal in their communication, and that can be really stressful for them. But when they're communicating with other autistic people or other autistic children, it can be much easier because those expectations are better understood between the two of them. So there's a nice quote in a recent tweet from an autistic woman who talked about how all my life I felt I was playing tennis with a ping pong paddle. Now I can find other people who also have ping pong paddles and play ping pong. So it's a nice way of understanding that. Sensory processing differences then. So for autistic children, there can be a very different way of experiencing sensory information. So if you see the image there on the right hand side of this slide, sensory information comes into our brains from our sense of touch, what we're seeing in our sense of sight, our taste, our smell, and our hearing. And our brains have to process and interpret that information. Our brains are always also working to filter out a lot of that information. And because autistic brains work a little bit differently, their sensory processing abilities can be very different to those skills and abilities within the neurotypical community. So this means that this can be a very disabling experience if an autistic person is in an environment that does not match their sensory experiences or their needs. So if they register sensory information differently, so if they are very sensitive to particular sensory information or undersensitive, so need a lot more stimulation from a sensory perspective in order to function, and if they're in an environment where that is not matching what their needs are, it can be very disabling for them and very stressful to try and tolerate those different sensory experiences. So it's very helpful if you can try to recognize the sensory experience that is happening. And most parents have a good sense of this for their child already. They will notice particular triggers to their senses. We often only hear about sensory difficulties. So for example, an intolerance for loud noises or particular clothing textures or things, but there are also very many positive aspects to sensory processing. So autistic people can often see great beauty in things like a light beam, or there can be a very intense, pleasurable experience from a particular sensory sensation. So there can be very positive aspects to the sensory processing piece as well, alongside some of those difficulties. So it's really important to know and understand both sides for your child. What do they seek? What do they enjoy? What helps them feel calm? But also what's really difficult for them to tolerate. Attention allocation then is another feature of autism. So one of the aspects of this is this idea of monotropism. So what this is your ability to focus your attention on one thing intensely. So it's also known as hyperfocus. You'll read about that if you're reading or listening to autistic people. And I suppose this idea is that, for neurotypical or non-autistic people, they usually spread their attention out to lots of different things. So you'll hear of multitasking or, doing lots of things at the same time. Whereas autistic people can often focus on one thing really intensely to the exclusion of everything else. And this allows a person to really, really go to much more in-depth ability or skill within what they're focusing on. So monotropism or hyperfocus, it can be a really great skill, but it can also interfere with other functioning in other areas as well. So sometimes people can get so absorbed in what they're doing that they might not eat, or they might not be able to move away from that if they're in school to focus on what they're learning, and so on. So another area then within autism is the idea of stimming behaviours. So stimming is another word for self-stimulatory behaviour. So this would be the things like the repetition of physical movements, so hand or finger or body movements. It might be repeating sounds or words, or stimming with objects as well. So for example, things like hand flapping, pacing, rocking your body, tapping your fingers, spinning, all of those different things. And it's really important to remember that everybody stims, not just autistic people. So examples of that might be biting your nails, playing with your hair, tapping a pen. They can all be considered examples of stimming. The difference, I suppose, for autistic people then is that they would have much less control over their stimming than neurotypical or non-autistic people do. And in the past, the view was that we must teach autistic people not to stim because only one particular neurotype was acceptable in society. And the concern was often that, well, if somebody is stimming, that this will bring negative attention to them and increase the likelihood of bullying. But we now understand better about what stimming is for autistic people, and how important it is and how okay it is for somebody to stim. So because we know that autism is just a different way of being in the world, and we know that this is okay, we know that stimming is just a part of autism, and knowing that will help to broaden the societal change that we need in terms of understanding what autism is and knowing that everybody has a right to be who they are in the world. So stimming can be considered as a protective response to overstimulation. So where we talked about earlier where autistic people process sensory information differently, and sometimes that can lead to them feeling overstimulated where they're getting too much sensory information that their brains can't interpret and process. They can become overstimulated then. So stimming behaviours help autistic children to block out excess sensory inputs when they are overwhelmed. It can help them to reduce the overall sensation of pain, although sometimes some stims can be causing pain themselves. For example, if somebody is hitting themselves or hitting their hands off something. Stimming can help to get extra sensory input if there is understimulation going on. And it can help your child to manage their emotions that might be intense or hurtful to them. It helps them to soothe themselves when they are distressed. So there's great important functions of stimming behaviour. And we know very much from the research and from learning from other autistic people that preventing stimming causes harm. So unless a person is actively hurting themselves as part of their stimming, preventing non-injurious stimming is harmful to the person. It's highly stressful for the person not to be allowed to stim and massively increases anxiety. So this is a nice graphic that helps to explain this about the importance of respecting the stim. So stims are a physical behaviour, as we've talked about, such as movements or sounds, and they're used by individuals with autism and also sensory processing disorder as well. And stimming provides sensory input. It helps to regulate a person and their neurological state. So stimming can be calming, it can be comforting, and it can also be communicative. It might express somebody's joy, their excitement, fear, if they're in pain, if they're tired, if they're overloaded. And as we've said before, stimming is healthy, it's functional, it's important, it's okay, it's valid. So this is a nice way of thinking about it. A stim might indicate that there is a problem, but a stim in itself is not a problem. So another way of learning about it from an autistic person themselves is this idea that stimming is like turning down the radio when you think you smell something burning. It's a way of turning off the other senses so that you can make sure nothing is burning. So fact number 6 then is that autism is associated with other conditions, but not always. So it often co-occurs with other things. As we said, not always. This is not true for everybody, but it is often associated with other things. So that could be learning difficulties, learning differences as well. It could be ADHD. There can sometimes be medical issues or genetic things going on. And then it can also be can co-occur with mental health issues as well. And these issues can often be deemed as being related to autism when in fact these other conditions also need support. So if your child is struggling with something, sometimes it can be put down to their autism, but sometimes it's related to these other things and it's not always related to autism. So it's really important that we know about these other things and that we support those other things as well as your child's autistic needs as well. Fact number 7 then is about the importance of learning from autistic people, and you'll have heard already throughout this webinar some of the things that are helpful as parents to know from autistic people, and all of the best learning that we have about autism comes from autistic people. So this idea that you will learn the most about autism from listening to autistic people is absolutely a 100% fact. And there's been huge growth in the autistic advocacy movement, both in Ireland, internationally. It's really just grown in the last few years. And we are lucky here in Ireland. We have very strong autistic voices. Here in Ireland, as I said, and also there are many people internationally. So examples of that would be Adam Harris, who is the CEO of As I Am, which is Ireland's national autism charity. And many of you might have heard Adam speaking. He regularly speaks on the radio. He would be on TV a lot in Ireland, so he'd be very well known. A few other examples are people like Mary Doherty. Then there's a couple of authors, Nisha Dolan, Dara McAnulty, who's an autistic teenager, who's a naturalist as well, and the wonderful speakers about autism and their experiences. And then internationally, we've got people like Wen Lawson, Temple Grandin, and many, many others who are working so well in teaching us what their experiences are like of being autistic. So there are multiple sources for hearing autistic people if you're wondering about where you can do that. So outloud.ie is a great website which has been set up by a group of Irish autistic adults who blog about their experiences, their ideas and projects and supports and advocacy. Twitter is a fantastic place to link with the autistic community, and you can use the hashtag #ActuallyAutistic to link in with the autistic community if you've got a question or if you want to find out about something. And then, of course, the As I Am website, which is Ireland's national autistic charity, which I mentioned there earlier when talking about Adam Harris, and that's asiam.ie. So this is an interesting way of looking at autism. This is from the autisticnotweird.com group. They have a Facebook group as well. And this reads as, this is from an autistic adult who says, "I'm autistic, which means everyone around me has a disorder that makes them say things they don't mean, not care about structure, fail to hyper-focus on singular important topics, have unreliable memories, drop weird hints, and creepily stare into my eyeballs. So why do people say you're the weird one? Because there's more of them than me." So this is the idea that the dominant neurotype in our society is the neurotypical neurotype, so the non-autistic people. And that is the dominant way that is expected in terms of communicating and interacting. But if we were to flip that around, and if autism was the dominant neurotype, then all the neurotypical people would be considered as being abnormal in how they communicate and how they interact. So this person is referencing that, where actually many ways in which neurotypical people communicate and engage and interact are very odd and strange when you look at it the way this person has outlined it, and yet that's the acceptable way. And the reason behind that, I suppose, is because there's more of those people interacting in that way and engaging in that way. So it's just an interesting way of looking at it. Fact number 8 then is the differences in terms of the gender piece. So for girls and women, and how we're really understanding better now about what that experience is like for girls and women. Just to say at the outset, this is not saying that every single girl or woman who is autistic experiences autism in this way, but many do, and the way that we're understanding this is improving all of the time. There's lots more research happening now in terms of what that experience is like, and very many women and girls and women it's quite often the case that they are older or in adulthood before it might be diagnosed or might be recognized. So we're getting better at learning about what that experience is like for children, for autistic girls, and what their experience is like growing up. So, as I said, the knowledge and understanding about the experience of autistic girls and women is growing, and it's very different to the experience of boys and men in the main. It's not true that it's for every single boy or every single man, it's different. There are some obviously similarities, but broadly speaking, the experience of girls and women can be very different to that of boys and men. So girls can tend to be more shy. They tend to copy or imitate social behavior or neurotypical social behavior more so than boys and men do. They can be very creative, very imaginative, oftentimes might have imaginary friends. They often want to make friends and seek to try and do that. They can be less prone to aggression. They can have very obsessive interests. They might enjoy arranging their toys, organizing and categorizing their toys, which sometimes can be seen as more socially acceptable for girls to do that than boys to do that. So that can sometimes be why it's more difficult to pick up autism in younger girls. And for many autistic girls, they can be more stressed at home than they might be in school. So the reasons we understand these differences and why girls often go under the radar, so to speak, is because they're oftentimes coping by camouflaging, using these camouflaging strategies. So they are better at observing and imitating others and hiding what their natural instinct is in terms of how they more instinctively would interact and communicate with others. So they're better at mimicking. However, quite often there comes a point where those strategies don't work as well anymore, or can be very stressful to keep that up, which is where it can be identified that autism is what's going on. So girls also often use their play and their imaginary friends to work out social situations and to figure out what can be utterly confusing to them. And then this idea of masking can be very prevalent for girls and for women as well. So knowing the script of what to do, so learning the script for a social situation and putting that into practice. Quite often girls are very skilled at doing that. However, over time, doing that can lead to a huge cost in terms of anxiety, in terms of stress, and people's mental health. So while girls have a better skill at doing that, it's not always the best thing that they are doing that. Fact number 8 is that autism has a strong genetic basis. So in terms of the causes of autism, first and the most important thing is that autism does not result from anything that a parent has done wrong, either in pregnancy or after a child is born. It is caused by differences in the development of the brain, and this occurs before birth. So there is a strong belief that there are genes at play within the development of autism, but the genetics of autism are very complex and are not yet fully understood. And there is a possibility that there might be a multi-gene interaction piece going on, and that plays a role in the cause for autism. So we don't yet fully understand the different pieces that are at play here, but there's a strong belief that there is some genetic component involved. So the next section, we're going to talk a little bit about the power of parents. So starting with this lovely quote here, which talks about how a perfect parent is a person with excellent child rearing theories and no actual children. So this is a really, really striking quote, because there really is no such thing as a perfect parent. We are all human beings, and there is no manual that comes with your child or a guide. We are all learning and we are all doing our best. So it's really important to remember that you are always the expert on your child. Nobody will ever know your child the way you know your child. So professionals can have knowledge and can have skills that are helpful, and they can bring those and work with you collaboratively on how they might be helpful with your child. But a professional will never know your child the way you know your child. Therapeutic sessions then are really important, but they can be limited in their effectiveness because they are spread out and they are time limited. So they might be an hour a week where you come for your OT session or your speech and language session or your physio session or your psychology session. But the day-to-day support piece is actually the most helpful piece, because therapy doesn't happen for just an hour a week, it happens every single day. And it's really important to build these interventions into your child's daily life. That idea of the short-term pain for the longer-term gain. So parent self-care then is really important. This image on the right is a very helpful analogy with this. For those of you who have flown on a plane, you will remember the instructions of being told always to put your own mask on before you help anybody else. And that same rule applies here. It's really important that you look after yourself first and foremost before you can look after your child or anybody else in the family. So why is this important? Because if you are stressed or tired, you're usually not the parent that you want to be. It's harder to manage your child's emotions and their needs if you're feeling like your own needs are not being met. So while there's not much that we can do about the challenges that might come our way, we can build our ability to respond to the challenges when they arrive. So we mightn't be able to control what's happening or what our child's condition is or what their strengths or their needs are, but we can manage our ability to respond to those things. And you really have to do what you can to sustain yourself along the parenting journey. That's true for every single parent, no matter what's going on for our children. But it's really about sustaining yourself for the longer term parenting journey. So it's really important that you model that good balance and healthy boundaries for your child and family. It's good for them to see you looking after yourself and taking time out to meet your sensory needs or your emotional needs or any of those things. So exactly that, being mindful of tending to your own sensory needs and your regulation needs is really important. But this can be challenging where your sensory needs might differ from your child's. So if your child enjoys the sensation of very loud noise, but your sensory needs say that you need the quiet time, balancing that can be challenging. But it's really important that that balance doesn't tip in one direction for either party, or the other one is going to find that really difficult. So it's about balancing that. So how can I support my child? So this is all about building our toolboxes. So the ideas here are really about helping you to survive and your child to thrive. So we're going to start with routine and structure. So thinking about your child's interests and activities. So does your child have a daily schedule of activities? Are the activities predictable for your child? Are there opportunities during the day to make real choices? And has there been any new change in your child's life recently that might upset him or her? Also really important to think about what impact is the environment having. So thinking about your home environment, also your school environment. So what's the location and venue like? What is the lighting like? What noises are there? Are there crowds? What's the space like? What food and drink is available? What sensory differences are there for your child and how they experience all of those things? Is there respect for your child and for their autistic needs? What's the communication style like? Does that fit with your child's preferences for communication, or is your child being expected to fit with the environment's expectations around communication? What's the social interaction like? What are the expectations? What are the demands? What are the opportunities for friendships? Remembering what we said earlier about how autistic people can often find it easier and more preferable to interact with each other than they can or that they find with interacting with neurotypical children. So are there opportunities for them to meet autistic friends? What about fostering independence or pain management? All of those things. So I'm going to show a clip now about the sensory experience, and it might give you an idea of that sense of overwhelm and the impact that the environment can have on a child.
Six, 7, 8, 9.
Take my hand.
I'm not naughty. I'm autistic. And I just get too much information.
So hopefully you'll have a sense from that video about how overwhelming an environment can be, and all of the different sensory information that can be very overwhelming and difficult for certain children, young people to interpret. I'm now going to show another clip about why routines and structure are important. And this is a clip of Adam Harris, who we spoke about earlier, who's the founder and the CEO of As I Am. And in this video, Adam is talking about what it feels like to be autistic, and why routines and structure are really important for autistic people.
Okay, now I think it can be quite difficult for those of us in the kind of neurotypical community to understand it exactly. And a metaphor does often help. The metaphor you use is that of the alien coming to Earth.
I think, it's what I always like to try and do is give people a sense of what it's like to be in the shoes of someone with autism, because the science doesn't necessarily mean a lot to a person from the outside. So basically, if you could imagine in the morning being put in a spaceship and blasted into outer space, and suddenly arriving in a planet that wasn't built for you, and you're not necessarily any less intelligent than anyone else on this planet, and you don't necessarily want not to be able to communicate, but you suddenly arrive on this planet, and the moment you get off the rocket, you're totally overwhelmed by your surroundings. Every noise seems louder, every smell is unpleasant, every texture, is very hard to deal with. And it's not just a case that you don't like this, it's actually that you can't deal with it. And then you meet your first alien and you want to communicate with this person, you want to know what's going on, but you actually can't tell by their body languages if they're coming in peace or if they're a threat. You don't know by their facial expression if they're friendly or if they're angry, and you can't decipher from their language if they're telling a joke or they want to be taken seriously. And you go to your first alien workplace or your alien school, and again, you're not necessarily less capable than anybody else, but you're in this world that's totally unfamiliar than you, and you think in an entirely different way to others. And this might be quite apparent to your colleagues or your fellow pupils, but they won't know how to deal with this. And when you're in this world where nobody seems to understand you and everything seems to be changing all the time, all you can try and do is put a routine and a structure in place. And that's why routine and structure is important.
And that keeps you kind of safe.
So that was Adam speaking about what it's like being autistic, and explaining the importance of the routines and the structure and how that can really help to make sense of an environment. The next thing to talk about then is about scheduling quiet time, and this is really important to help your child get a breather and get some time out from all of that sensory overload and that experience that Adam was describing there. So it's that time to relax and chill out, which is very important for autistic children, and they might need some support to manage that free time, or they might need time to engage in any particular special interests that they have, which can be very soothing and relaxing and calming for them. So it's really important to schedule that into their day. I'm going to speak a little bit then about tolerating change, because I suppose while we're talking about the importance of routine and structure, life is very changeable and unpredictable, and different things can happen that aren't always planned for. So this idea of tolerating change is important in terms of that balance. So for autistic children, that difficulty tolerating change can be due to the sense of uncertainty about the world and a difficulty predicting other people's behaviour. So routines and rituals really help to reduce unpredictability and establish what's likely about what's going to happen. Your child's preference is likely to live their life in a highly predictable way. That's probably what they would prefer to do, but society is unpredictable. So it's really about finding a balance of both. As much as you can, having things as predictable as possible, but also building uncertainty into your child's day in a structured way. So sometimes there might be a clearly established morning routine, but there might be a time in the afternoon where you don't know what's happening. So within your child's visual schedule, it might be listed as a wild card or it's a wait and see time, but your child child knows that that's coming up in the plan. So there's a structured way around building in the unpredictable times, or where you might know what's happening, but at least they know that that's what's happening, that we don't know what's happening, if that makes sense. So some helpful strategies for autistic children can be about being told that the change is going to happen if there is something that's different happening. Talking through the sequence then of what's going to happen, so using visual supports or social stories to help them to prepare for that change. Keeping everything else the same can be very helpful where there is a change happening. And then giving some control to your child over the non-essential issues. So letting them choose how they would like for things to happen, for things that aren't really too essential in the whole process, is really helpful because it gives them that sense of control. Managing transitions then, so how to do this? So transitions being from one activity to another or from one environment to another. So the first thing to do in managing this is really about assessing the transition in terms of what the activities are, who the people are that are involved, what the environments are that are involved, and where your child is transitioning from one thing to another. Then it's about preparing for that transition. So you can use visual timers to help prepare for this, or visuals which help to prepare for that change, or transition objects. So different ways of preparing your child that a change is going to happen and something is going to be different. So it can be really helpful to reduce the number of transitions that happen in a day if they're stressful for your child. And it can also be helpful to record each transition. So what happens, what works well, what didn't go so well, so that you can learn from that the next time to help make it a more smooth process for your child. Using communication passports can be really helpful with other carers or with teaching staff in school, where you can give them some information in a written way around, look, this is what's happened this morning, or this is how they're feeling today, or these are the things that have come up for them, and that's written down and handed in the form of a passport to the person you're handing over to. That can be really helpful. And then when you're moving your child from one activity that they really enjoy to another activity that maybe they don't enjoy so much, having a countdown or a first then chart can really help. So the countdown really lets your child know that they will have to change activities in a few minutes. So something like 15 minutes and the TV goes off, or 30 minutes until bedtime. And then I suppose what you would do is mention that change in activity every few minutes until the change happens. So helping them to prepare and to know that this is coming. So using the egg timer or the alarm clocks, the different visual countdowns on the right hand side of the screen here, there's some examples of these. And using these can be really helpful because it allows the blame for the change happening is external to you. It's the counter that says they have to change activities, not you. So you can really empathize with them around how difficult they might find it, but the timer says it's time to change now. So it can be helpful to use those things, and it also helps them to really see how much time they have left when they have a visual reference for those. Just if anybody is interested in buying any visual timers or countdowns, you can get them in lots of different places. There is a good website, an Irish company called Thinking Toys. So they're www.thinkingtoys.ie, and they have a range of these different timers and countdowns and different things. We also have a whole workshop webinar on visual supports if you're interested in finding out more about how to use them, what works well in different scenarios, and all the different types that are available. So you can request that from the service if you would like to view that webinar as well. So supporting social communication with your child. So firstly, going back to this idea of what we said at the very start about learning about your child's preferences for communication and interaction. So really spend some time thinking about what their preferences are. what's their natural instinct. So this is not what do we want for them, what would we like, how would we like them to be communicating or interacting, but what are their preferences if we waved a wand and the world was able to accommodate their best way of interacting and communicating, what would that look like? And if you're unsure about this, it's a good idea to spend some time observing and thinking about what works best for your child and what doesn't work well. If your child is able to engage, you could ask them about what they feel or how they experience it when they're being asked to communicate or interact in various ways. So, for example, if there's an expectation in school that they must make eye contact when they're talking with their teacher, what does that feel like for them? How do they experience it? You could also ask people who know your child well what they think your child's preferences are. And you'll get information that way about what they see works well for them or what doesn't in different environments. And remember that when your child is stressed, their ability to communicate in ways that are expected of them from society will reduce. So their ability to make eye contact or to communicate verbally might reduce, and you might see more stimming behaviours as they're trying to deal and manage their stress. So another way of thinking about communication is thinking about how we as perhaps neurotypical people might use visual supports, and we all use them. Everybody in society uses them. We use them every day. And here are some examples of the everyday visual supports that we use. So signage when we're walking, when we're driving, looking at all those signs, calendars, a menu in a restaurant, making a shopping list, following instructions for flat pack furniture and different things like that. So these are all examples of visual supports that are really everyday that we all use. So thinking about, would your child benefit from visual support? So what would be helpful for them? And how do we tailor it to their communication needs? So for some children, we might be using things like first then boards. For other children, we might be using picture examples of their daily schedule or routines to help them remember the different steps that are involved or the different things that they need to do. So why is it important to use visual supports? So the reasons it's important is because autistic children are often visual learners, and this plays to their communication needs. Visual supports help autistic children to understand their environment and the demands that are being made. And visual supports help autistic children to keep calm, and they also help to encourage independence. And finally, autistic children really benefit from an environment that is organised and that's predictable. It really helps them to keep that sense of regulation when they know what's happening and they know what's expected of them. There's a lovely quote from an autistic lady whose name is Temple Grandin. She's a very prominent autistic advocate and has taught us a lot about what being autistic is like. But as she explains, she talks about how I'm a visual thinker, not a language-based thinker, and my brain is like Google Images. So her communication preference is really all about the visual and thinking in pictures. She's written a book about this as well, if anyone is interested in reading it, which is called Thinking in Pictures. So visual supports are really important for her, and her preference is not to communicate verbally, although she can, but her preference is to communicate visually and through pictures, and that's how her brain works. That's how she thinks. So looking at some communication tips then, and these are from the National Autistic Society in the UK. First and foremost, it's a good idea to when you're communicating with your child, to get their attention and trying to keep their attention, always use their name at the beginning if you're talking to them verbally, so that they're prompted to know that it's in reference to them, that you're talking to them. Try to ensure that they're paying attention before asking a question or giving an instruction, but bear in mind that how they communicate to you that they're paying attention might be different to how other children. It might not be that they look at you. There might be more subtle indicators that they're paying attention. It mightn't be what you expect them to show. And also use hobbies and interests as ways to engage with your child and ways to communicate with them. Processing information, then, just to know this, when you're communicating with your child, it can be really difficult for your child to filter out less important information. So to know what the key points are in what you're saying to them, or what's being communicated to them either through words or through pictures, what is the important part and what is the bit that they can filter out. So too much information can very easily lead to feeling overloaded. So most autistic children really benefit from time to process what you're saying or what the instruction is. So ways that you can help them with that processing piece is to say less, use keywords, pause between words and phrases, and don't use too many questions. Use less non-verbal communication as well. So reducing the need for eye contact or gestures can really support your child's understanding of what you're trying to communicate with them. Where they have to understand both methods of communication, it can be really difficult for them doing that. So reducing those expectations around non-verbal communication can really be a helpful thing. So try to avoid open-ended questions as well. So if you're asking questions, keep them short and only ask the most necessary ones. It can be helpful as well to give options or choices within questions so that it's easier for your child to know how they might answer. And also then be specific. So asking, if you're picking up your child from school, be specific in what you're asking them. So things like, did you enjoy your lunch? How did you enjoy your maths today? Rather than how was your day, which is a broad, more vague question. Be clear in your communication with your child. Try to avoid using things like sarcasm or figurative language, idioms, exaggerations, or these rhetorical questions, which all of these things can be utterly confusing and really difficult for your child to understand or to know what you mean by them. And if you do use these things, explain what you've said and be clear about what you really mean to say. So if you say to your child, like the example we used earlier, it's raining cats and dogs, we don't really mean that there are cats and dogs falling from the sky. We mean that it's raining heavily. So explaining that can be really helpful. Social stories then are a tool that were devised by a lady called Carol Gray way back in 1991. And what they are is a visual approach to helping your child understand a social situation. So they're a story written from your child's perspective, which can help them to prepare for something that might be new or a change that's happening. So just to help them understand what's going to happen or what the change might be. And they can be used for all ability levels, all age ranges. And as I said, they can help to establish knowledge and expectations about social situations that your child might encounter. So, for example, things like going to the dentist. But be very careful that they should not be used to teach an autistic child how to appear to be non-autistic. They're not for being used for helping your child to not be autistic anymore, because that will be very stressful for your child. This is more about using this as a tool to help your child understand social situations and interactions that might be difficult for them to understand or unpredictable. So there's a great app that you can get that can really help you develop some social stories or social situations or tools around that. It's called Story Maker, and it's just an example of one app that can help you making social stories that can be tailored for your child. So if you would like more information about that, if you search on YouTube for a clip which is Story Maker demonstration and it's 2013, that will show you exactly how that works and how to create your social stories using that app. So the next section we're going to talk about is behaviour, and just to start with a quote here from a parent of an autistic child who was talking about how when their child is behaving in ways that other people might see as being challenging, they would say, my child is not giving me a hard time, my child is having a hard time. So that's really the premise in terms of how we understand behavioral differences within autism. So, to start with this nice graphic here, which is from a website, theautismdad.com. So this is a dad of autistic children who was talking about the idea of meltdowns within autism. So, just to run through this, he would talk about how autism is easily among the most misunderstood of all the human conditions. And among the most misunderstood things about autism is the meltdown. So, meltdowns within autism are not a disciplinary problem. They're not an indication of bad parenting. They are not an indication of a misbehaving child, and they are not within the child's control. So they are a result of overstimulation. They're the body's way of purging, and they are very common within people who are autistic, and they are easily confused with tantrums. So they might look the same as a tantrum, but they are a very different thing, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what they are. So meltdowns and shutdowns. So when your child becomes overwhelmed, this can lead to either a meltdown or a shutdown. So meltdowns and shutdowns are very intense for your child and often are utterly exhausting for them. And if you want to learn more about an autistic person talking about autistic meltdowns and overloads and what they are, if you search for this exact wording that's here, autistic meltdowns and overloads, what's that? If you search for that on YouTube, the clip that you'll see is really helpful in learning about what the experience of that is like from an autistic person. So I'd encourage you to maybe pause the video here and search for that if you'd like to have a look at that. So meltdowns are different to tantrums, as the intention of a tantrum is to get a response, so to provoke a reaction in somebody, whereas meltdowns are a response. So meltdowns are uncontrollable reactions to stress, and autistic people of any age can have meltdowns, not just children. Meltdowns look different from person to person. They often include crying, screaming, stimming, and a complete loss of control. It's really important that an autistic person should never be punished for having a meltdown. They are completely out of the autistic person's control. Meltdowns are exhausting, both physically and mentally, and your child will need time to recover after having a meltdown. So shutdowns are slightly different to meltdowns. They can appear less intense than a meltdown, but they can be equally debilitating and exhausting for your child. So shutdowns are also a response to being overwhelmed, but instead of going the more expressive route of stimming or crying or having those reactions, your child might appear more passive, they will go quiet or appear to switch off. So they are so overwhelmed that their brain just shuts down. And autistic people describe how this feels as though the mind is past a state of being able to interpret anything that is coming into it. So signs and triggers to watch out for in terms of shutdowns and meltdowns. So the triggers can often be tiredness, hunger, discomfort, or being sick. Sensory overload is a huge trigger for a meltdown or a shutdown. Transitions, where there isn't good preparation or support around a transition. Novelty and uncertainty, so new unpredictable situations. Task performance anxiety, so going into school and knowing that there's an exam or they're going to have to perform in some way can be really stressful and can trigger a meltdown. Pressure to socialize, so having to interact or engage at break times where it's too much for your child, that can trigger a meltdown. Unexpected change we've talked about as well, and unstructured social settings can be too much and overwhelming and can trigger shutdowns or meltdowns. So then the physical signs, as we talked about earlier for the meltdown, can be the increase in stimming behaviours. It might be a change in your child's voice, an increase in motor activity, an increase in repetitive actions, or a change in their body language, their facial expressions, or their posture. So, autism and overwhelm. This is a nice graphic, and it can be a helpful way of thinking about your child's regulation and what their needs are. If you imagine that for all of us, we all carry around a bucket, and our stress levels are impacted by how full or how empty our bucket is. So, things that fill up the bucket can lead to us becoming more stressed, and if that bucket overfills, and our stress levels tip over, then we will become overwhelmed and will be too stressed to be able to function or perform. So this is true also for autistic people and autistic children, but their bucket fills a little bit differently to how non-autistic people's buckets fill, if that makes sense. So I'll read this, which might help to explain it a little better. So the same activities that can cause a meltdown one day may not have the same effect the next day. But why is this? So each activity we do or stimulus we come across adds to the bucket. Stimuli may be something as simple as bright lights or background noises. Things we enjoy can also add to the bucket. As each individual stimulus adds to the bucket, the water level begins to rise. Some activities that calm us, such as stimming or time alone, can help to empty the bucket before it overflows. If things are being added to the bucket faster than it slowly empties, the bucket can overflow, causing a meltdown. So meltdowns are different for everyone, and it's important to give time and space to autistic people and not to judge them in terms of how they manage that. Meltdowns are out of an autistic person's control. So that will give you a sense of why some days your child is able to tolerate the visit to the park and other days it triggers a meltdown, and it's got to do with how full their bucket is. So if your child is having a meltdown, what are the things that you can do to help calm the meltdown? So firstly, removing any demands and lowering the stimulation that's in the environment for your child can really help. Slow down and lower your voice. If it's possible, move your child to a safe area. Stay supportive. You can say things like, "It's okay, you are safe." If your child is receptive, you can help them to calm with deep pressure or with rhythmic patterns, repetitive patterns that can help. If they're not receptive to that, back off and allow your child to recover. Give them some space and some time to recover. Their recovery might be gradual, and they are vulnerable to further meltdowns because remember, the meltdown is happening because the bucket is overflowing. So the bucket is still full even while they're recovering. So they will need that time to gradually empty things out. So the next section, we're going to talk about some tips for parents. The first tip to talk about is the importance of letting yourself grieve if that's where you feel your emotions are at as you learn about autism and as you learn about your child's autistic needs. It's very okay to grieve the loss of what you expected when you became a parent. So working through any grief is an important step in being able to move forward positively with your child. So it's widely acknowledged that although autism is understood as not being anything wrong with your child or anything broken that needs fixing, it's acknowledged that autism is a difference in how your child experiences the world and that that's okay. However, as a parent, when you became a parent first, quite often for most of us, we had an expectation about what our child's journey through life might look like. And when we learn that actually that journey is going to be different for them, even though we know that being different is okay and is valid, it can still lead to that sense of loss around, well, this is different to what I thought things were going to be. And it is okay to acknowledge that and to grieve for that loss while still loving and accepting your child. So in doing this and working through any grief that you might feel, this will allow you to begin to see the beautiful things that can come with autism. So that quirkiness, that sense of fun, that different perspective that can really strengthen a family. So it's really important to give yourself and those around you that time to adjust. You are still parenting the same child that you were parenting before you learned about their autism diagnosis. They're still the very same child that they were before. There's just a difference in terms of how you understand them and what their pathway through life might be. The next tip is to establish a support network. So this might be through family members, it might be through different support groups, either in-person ones locally within the local area, or it could be online. And there's wonderful groups now online through Facebook, across Ireland, across the UK, internationally. There's great connections that can happen. It could be friends that are involved in your support network, and quite often for many parents their friends will also be parenting autistic children as well, and there can be a great sense of connection with that. And the real important piece in linking with other parents of autistic children is through that learning about how there is hope and there is a future with autism. The support network could involve your school community, your child's teacher, their SNA. It could be professional or clinical supports or services that really help in terms of your support network. The next tip is about being selective. So with autism, there is so much information that's out there. It is just so huge, and it's in so many different sources on the internet, in books, in other people, in podcasts, web pages, articles, everywhere. So it's really important to give yourself some time to evaluate which organizations and which people you trust and you feel are helpful in your understanding of autism and learning about that and what your child's needs are. Don't believe everything that you read and everything that you watch. Question everything. Be selective about what you embrace that is relevant for your child. Otherwise, there is also a risk of you becoming overwhelmed because there is so much out there. So it's okay to focus on one or two things just at a time. If you're wondering about extra support or learning in terms of how you can evaluate which organizations, which information, which people to trust, there's a really helpful guide on how to do that on this website here, thinkingautismguide.com. And if you go into that, you'll see what are the tips and what are the hints around how to know whether something is reliable and valid or whether something needs to be dismissed. The next tip is to listen and learn from the autistic community. This cannot be overstated enough. This is so important. And as I said earlier, virtually everything that's really helpful and that's useful about what we know about autism comes from autistic people telling us about their experiences. And when I'm saying autistic people telling us about their experiences, I am including people who do not communicate verbally, who are autistic, who communicate through pictures or through other communication systems, who are able to share their experiences of being autistic and what they tell us about their experiences. This is not just about the experiences of autistic people who use words to communicate or spoken words to communicate. We know a lot about the experience of non-verbal autistic people also. So these are some of the sources of where you can find out about the autistic community, link with them and hear what they say and learn about their experiences. So Facebook is wonderful for that. Twitter, so these are the hashtags that you can use, Actually Autistic and Asking Autistics, if you want to link with the autistic community on Twitter, or if you have a question that you want to ask. And I have to say that the autistic community that's there on Twitter, on Facebook, are a wonderfully supportive, inclusive advocacy group. They are fantastically welcoming, and very happy to share their experiences and to support each other and others who are wanting to learn about autism. YouTube is a fantastic source of information. Be careful again, and remember that evaluation piece. Evaluate what you're watching. Blogs, books, podcasts, there's so much out there that you can link in with. The next tip is to remember that you are the expert. So trust your own instinct. You are the expert on your own child, and nobody will be more expert on your child than you are. So really, it's really important to give yourself time to figure out what autism means for your child. Autistic brains can be very different from non-autistic brains, and if you're not autistic yourself, then learning how to recognize and understand these differences may take time as a parent. So learn about autistic learning styles and how any co-occurring conditions might also be impacting on your child's learning. And then, you're really rounding off your expertise on your own child. You're really getting to the depth of what their needs are, what their strengths are, and how to help them move forward positively to thrive in their lives. Learn your child's communication style. So everyone communicates, even those who don't speak. And those who do speak may not be able to verbalize all of their intentions, and they can have their communication needs underestimated. So we can often assume that because somebody is talking that they're fine with communication, but that can often be not the case. So they can often have some challenges in terms of what their communication needs are, and they will also have preferences for how they like to communicate, even through verbal means. And for those who don't speak, be really careful not to assume that they do not understand. As I said earlier, we know a lot about the experiences of non-speaking autistic people because they are able to communicate in other ways what their experience is. And they talk about their awareness of what other people are saying, and they know and they experience things, where people are talking about them in the same room and make those assumptions that they don't understand, which is not the case. So be very sure to treat them as though they do understand everything that you say, as they very likely do. The next tip is to find autistic role models for your child. And this is really about knowing that although you love and accept your child, if you are not autistic, then it is really important to connect them with the community that they belong to. And there's a lovely tweet here from the Autistic Advocate who answered this question about how has he benefited from connecting with autistic people. So he says, validation of relatable experience, identifiable, recognizable neuroculture, friendship, connection, shared knowledge, shared interests, shared monotropic experience, and learning styles. And he sums it up by saying it's the feeling of being home. The next tip is to look after yourself. We've talked about this already, and the importance of putting on your own mask before helping another passenger. So remember to pace yourself in an effort to avoid your own burnout, and think about your own sensory needs and your own regulation needs in parenting your child. Take breaks wherever you can. Make sure you exercise, you're sleeping, you're eating healthily, and nourishing yourself. So the next section we're going to talk about then is accessing information. Some advice on internet searching. We've talked about this a little bit already in terms of evaluating information that you're getting or reading and how to do that. So while the internet is a great source of information, there is also a lot of information that is out of date, unreliable, or incorrect. Information may not be relevant or specific to your own child's needs, and if it's possible, ask a member of your service for a list of reliable and relevant websites to visit. These are some of the websites that are reliable, and there are more, so your service should be able to give you some more. But these are some to get you started. So Ireland's National Autism Charity, which we've talked about before, is As I Am, and they're at www.asiam.ie. So As I Am works to create a society in which every autistic person is empowered to reach their own potential and fully participate in society. And they have lots of webinars, lots of events happening. They are very well known in Ireland, very well connected with communities, with universities, with schools. They have school projects happening, lots happening in their area. The Middletown Centre for Autism is also a really good place to go to their website. They offer free training events for parents, teachers and professionals. So they cover, their remit is all of Ireland. They're based up in the north of Ireland, but they cover the whole island. So definitely link in with them. There is the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, and they have a publication for parents which is called Start Here, a guide for parents of autistic kids. So you can link in on their website as well. Then there are a couple of other guides on websites that are really helpful. The Neuroclastic one, the Autism Spectrum According to Autistic People, Autism 101, is really good, really helpful in explaining lots of these ideas and concepts around neurodiversity and how to support your child. And then there's also the Thinking Person's Guide to Neurodiversity, and the link is there for that one as well. So we're going to move now towards the end of the webinar today, and we're going to talk about some recommended books that you might be interested in. So these books are fantastic. They talk about autism from the neurotype concept and from the idea of celebrating neurodiversity and autism being something that's considered as part of the umbrella of neurodiversity, and how to work with your child's strengths as well as the challenges that they might be experiencing. So these three books are highly recommended. So Uniquely Human, A Different Way of Seeing Autism, the first one there at the top, is a wonderful book. Then Autism, How to Raise a Happy Autistic Child by Jessie Hewitson is another really wonderful book. Autism and Asperger Syndrome in Childhood is by Luke Bearden, and that's really recommended as well. Then there's a few other ones that you might be interested in. Loud Hands, Autistic People Speaking is learning more about the autistic experience from autistic people themselves. Born on a Blue Day is another book written by an autistic person and his experiences. And then the same with The Reason I Jump, which is all about one boy's particular experience of being autistic. And then Neurotribes by Steve Silberman is a large book, but it's very much a handbook on neurodiversity and autism and how we understand autism currently. So to finish the webinar today, there are a few final thoughts, final notes to leave you with to reflect on. So the first is that everyone is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. So I think what this is getting at is the idea that we are all unique, wonderful human beings who have our own particular unique set of strengths and challenges, and those strengths that we have will be different within each of us. And because they're different doesn't mean that they're less valid or less important. So it's that idea of what are our expectations around what's acceptable, what's valid, what's authentic, what's unique, what's important, and not just having one set of expectations around that, but broadening that out to recognize the uniqueness in the difference that's there amongst us. And the other thought to leave you with is a child with autism is not ignoring you. They are simply waiting for you to enter their world. So I'm going to leave you in this webinar with that invitation for entering the world of autism with your child and really getting into that idea of exploring things from their perspective and understanding what their strengths are, what their needs are, what their experiences are, which will help you to better manage and support them with what their challenges are. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope this webinar was useful, and if you need to contact our service in Carlow and Kilkenny in relation to this webinar, please feel free to do so. Thank you.